Hello and welcome to our discussion about the class. Now, up until now, we have discussed the things that are necessary for a student to be, do, and have in order to learn well. Motivation, commitment, preparation. The learning is done by the student. They produce the knowledge, and so all learning happens according to those things. We also talked about the teacher, what the teacher needs to be and do, and we obviously think of things that the teacher has, but we haven't actually discussed them. When we talk about the class, we're talking about everything else. When we talked about the student, it's an individual. You put a teacher involved in a relationship there, you now have two people. What about everything else that goes into education? They're broken down in the following categories. So when we talk about the class, we're talking about the world as an environment for what goes into that isn't exactly the student or the teacher. So first, let's talk about accountability. Now, accountability here is simply being held responsible for something by someone. So obviously, what's the first thing in accountability? Yeah, grades. Do they motivate students to do things? Yeah, of course they do. And you'll notice that accountability often affects motivation. But some students will feel accountable even when they don't feel motivated, which is why those are two different things. But here's a good thought for you on accountability. President Thomas S. Monson in Preach My Gospel around goals, so I'm going to put that in there. Yeah, goals help you to feel accountable. Said, when performance is measured, performance improves. When performance is measured and reported, the rate of improvement accelerates. So, in accountability is a report that things have been accomplished. And think about just requiring somebody to come back or expecting somebody to come back and report on what they have done or to make a commitment to set a goal. It affects whether or not they will actually achieve what they have set out to do. Now, if they don't achieve the goal, is that really the point, or is the activity that they have participated in to make progress important? Yes, but the goal itself is what instills that accountability in them. There are quizzes. Now, some things happen from teachers in a normal classroom setting. Well, think about this. You're not going to give them a grade, but as a tutor, can you help with these other things? And I'm going to tell you from a teacher's perspective, when a student goes and visits a tutor, that visit in and of itself is providing a certain amount of accountability for the student. The student feels accountable to their peers. And look at that. Yes, indeed, you can feel accountable to your peers, to your parents, to a tutor. And so you as a tutor, you have quite a bit of flexibility in how you implement these. You create a small little quiz at the beginning of a tutoring session, or you quiz them at the end of a tutoring session. You ask them to report, send them a text after they get out of an exam or when they've finished an assignment. Many of these things are within your capability, and accountability is an eternal principle that help people to learn better. Good. Let's talk about feedback. Feedback is an essential part of education, most easily seen by its lack thereof. Think about what happens if you don't get feedback. You spin your wheels. You have no idea where you're going. You don't know if the practice you're doing is correct or if it is not correct. I learned how to play the piano when I was very young. I didn't really learn a great deal. It's a very basic level. But I remember one song, I didn't know that it had a sharp in it. And so I learned the entire song incorrectly. Practice doesn't make perfect. Practice, I'm going to write this down, practice doesn't make perfect. Practice makes permanent. Now, when you have something that is permanent, and it was done wrong, it is now permanently wrong. So practice only makes perfect if you're practicing the right things. So feedback, there are two key qualities of feedback. Number one, it has to be accurate. I want you to picture driving. You're driving down the road and you see the road, you see cars in front of you, you see road signs and telephone poles, stuff like that. Your eyes are receiving visual feedback. Now, imagine what happens when you are driving and what you are seeing is not a representation of reality. For example, you have frost on your windshield, or it's really a rainy, stormy night, and you are not able to see everything of where you are. It changes. And in fact, when there is no feedback, your driving is very slow, if at all, to avoid wrecks. So, same thing happens. The more accurate the feedback on how students can see where they are, what they're doing right and wrong, accurate and correct. It has to be there. If it is not, and that's part of your job as a tutor, is to make sure you understand what they're doing and what they're doing that is correct and what they're doing that isn't correct when they're showing their work and when you're examining their processes, those sorts of things. The other thing is that it needs to be timely. Now, when you're driving a car, you need instant feedback all the time from your eyes. However, the discussion that we had about the involvement level of the teacher says that sometimes a teacher needs to pull back and let the student work on going through the process on their own. They may need to fail. So you will have to execute some judgment here on should you give feedback immediately. For example, if you write 2x plus 3 equals 9 and the student adds 3 to both sides, you could immediately jump in and say, you did something wrong. Or you could back off just a little bit and see if they can pick up their own mistake. So sometimes it may need to be waiting a little bit and sometimes instantly. But if you wait too long and they've done 20 problems before you check to see if any of their work was correct, they will probably have forgotten what they did and the feedback will be useless. For example, if you're driving down the road and someone shows you a picture of a road sign that happened 20 miles ago, that feedback, it's too late. It doesn't help you to drive correctly there. So accurate and timely feedback. Not too soon, not too late, and there's not a rule for that on when, but that it is at a time that doesn't take away their learning, but is soon enough that it can be reacted to. Alrighty, good. So that's feedback. And without it, education doesn't go very much. Okay, time and resources. Let's illustrate this with a calculator. In Algebra 1, they get to use calculators. I once had an Algebra 1 student who came into class with a TI 89. Wow. Now, for those of you that don't know this calculator, this can do almost everything on the planet. In fact, I'm not sure how to run this thing all the way. But the TI-89 is a powerful calculator and in fact can help with calculus and engineering and statistics and all sorts of things. It's a little bit too complicated for me to run. And students, Algebra 1 students, for sure, this is not the right resource, even though it's a very powerful resource. The thing about resources is that they need to be appropriate. Now, appropriate meaning matching up to the learning and the learning level of that student. Now, that's an important word to keep in mind, that it has to match them. This could be a very good resource for something else. But think about all the resources that you need in order to do math very well. Yeah, you got to have some paper. You got to have a pencil or a pen, some writing utensil. You may even need a chalkboard. Okay, that's old school talking, but I love chalkboards. So you may need a chalkboard or a whiteboard. Think about what the students need. They need exercises submitted. They need some sort of resource, some sort of instruction. It's interesting. Take these away, and what does the math class look like? Yeah, you see, these are really necessary thing. So the resources that the student has, they need to have them. And there may be an investment of a few dollars to get a normal calculator. But if they don't have the resources, it's like trying to play basketball without hands. That's one of the resources for playing basketball is your hands. And so you need to have appropriate resources to what you're trying to learn. Included in that is time. And this is something that the students who have learning disabilities have a very this is difficult for them to realize that they have to have time. Each student has their individual needs, but there is a requirement for time. There's a myth or a fable handed down that Euclid was working down in Alexandria in Egypt, and the Ptolemies, whoever was in charge, the pharaoh at the time, said, I would like a royal road to learning. I would like a royal road to geometry, apparently referring to some easier way of getting there than going through hard, laborious study. And thinking that he could just change the world by his views, that pharaoh expressed to this great mathematician that started geometry, Euclid. I should put that name down here. Euclid. So, give me a royal road to learning and geometry. And Euclid retorted, there is no royal road to geometry. There's no shortcut. You have to invest the time that it takes your brain to be able to produce and know that whatever set of knowledge. Which means if students are scrunching themselves out of time to do their homework, they simply will not be able to accomplish it because it's as detrimental to them as taking away any of these other resources that are necessary to learning. Our brains cannot produce an infinite amount of knowledge in a finite amount of time, so there is a limit of this resource. As tutors, what does this mean for you? This means that you may have to help students understand that 2 or 3 hours on a homework assignment, if they're struggling in a math class, may be appropriate, and to not give up because or be discouraged because it took time. Go ahead and invest that time. Same thing happens with anything you're going to learn in the gospel. You have to invest that time. Okay, moving on. Next one, teaching. Now, this is teaching for learning, that the student has an opportunity to learn and then to teach somebody else. Now, this is something that I really struggled with as a true principle of education. I thought, do we have doctors and engineers who have never taught it to somebody who don't know it as well as they could? Are they incompetent? Well, no, they're not necessarily incompetent, but what's fascinating about this is they would learn it better if they had to teach it. There are some great quotes. Boyd K. Packer has one that says, you don't know something until you have taught it. You don't truly own that material until you have the ability to give it away to somebody else. Stephen R. Covey has a great quote, and it says, when you expect to teach, your mind is prepared to learn. In the gospel, we have this experience most dramatically when you are called to be a teacher of a class or you are called to serve a mission. Return missionaries will tell you that they deepened their own understanding by teaching. Some of the things that make teaching so valuable is that you have to organize it. You can't just have produced the material, produce that knowledge. You now have to organize it in a way that you believe is palatable for someone else to start understanding it. You have to organize it. Then you have to articulate it. Then you have to analyze how somebody else is understanding. And all of these activities help open your mind when you're pondering about those things to insights and inspiration to a deeper understanding of stuff. For example, you guys could do 2/5 plus 3/10. Most of you guys can do that, and you're like, oh, that's no problem. You get a common denominator. Well, when you're teaching it and you know somebody's going to ask the question, how come you don't just take 5 plus 10? Well, really ponder what that word denominate means. And we've discussed that before, but this actually has a meaning. It's a label. To denominate is to label something. And that insight is available because you're going about teaching somebody else. It's a very powerful tool, but you need to understand that it can be overused and abused. Before teaching happens, you need to allow somebody to learn something and then to teach it. So teaching will develop and increase the learning, but some have tried to replace this because this is so powerful in deepening understanding. They're like, oh, good, here's something you've never seen before, now go and teach it. And there has to be the learning preceding that. Missionaries are not called at the age of 8 or 10. They go through a process of learning the gospel before they're asked to be teachers in it. Okay, good. And the final one, community. Now, community is what we're referring to as a community here is all of the people. This is the human thing. Notice I haven't actually talked about humans here except as examples of how to implement accountability, but this is the human interaction. This could be the actual class. Now you'll notice up here when I said the word class, that referred to everything that wasn't teacher and student. Here, the people in the classroom. Yeah. It could be their family. In tutoring, guess who it is? All of the tutors in the lab. When you walk into the math lab and you see red vests or those snazzy t-shirts walking around, there is a community that is building. Malcolm Gladwell, who is a popular author now but has studied some unique social phenomenon, studied some people at that had a really high capability when they were young children, very high IQs or whatever. And he followed them, and about half of them turned into amazing contributors to society, and some of them did not. Those that didn't, he actually started analyzing what variables were different among those that ended up very successful and those that did not, and ended up in a mediocre something that was very beneath the potential that they could have had. And this is what the conclusion of his study was. Those that turned out to be mediocre or even subpar, he said, they lacked something that could have been given to them if we'd only known they needed it. A community around them that prepared them properly. Another study was done at UC Berkeley. And they were doing some calculus problems, and a guy was a graduate student. And he's like, how are calculus students successful and what are not? And the biggest thing was that they selected a group of people around them to help them go. As a tutor, you have a huge influence. The instructors of these students view you as part of that community. And the students may have very differing views on math. They may think it's absolutely terrible and they prefer to eat a bowl of nails for breakfast. Your attitude of lifting them and building them has a huge impact on what happens in the classroom. For you as a teacher, the family they come from has a huge impact. If they're the first person to go to college and their parents really aren't excited that they're going to college, think they're wasting 4 years of their life, that will affect how they are motivated. It isn't your job to fix them, but to be aware of that community and how it is affecting them. At college, here's a human interaction that definitely impacts learning. I have had both kinds of roommates, some where they were up late, kept me up, and were all about playing. And I've had others that were very serious and very supportive and asked me how classes were going. And both kinds. This can be a positive or a negative influence. Friends, family, classmates, group study, being in the library, all of this is brought up in this particular course so you as a tutor can identify, hey, what's going on? What type of community is helping or hindering these students to be successful in their college education, in learning? So when you go through this, all of these, and you think about it, I'm actually going to put the teacher in here for just a minute. Yeah, we talked about the teacher's influence in that relationship. For you, the teacher is part of the community and how they view him and the influence that comes on there. You can't fix them, but you can certainly affect and help them to analyze how these relationships are hindering or helping. All right, so those are the things that are outside of just the student and the teacher that do have a profound impact on them. When you are struggling with how to tutor a student, these are the things that you need to consider. Yes, you need to look at them and their motivation and their preparation and their ability and make sure everything's appropriate. You need to look at yourself as a tutor. Those were in the previous videos. But these are the things that are external circumstances that you need to start evaluating and helping the student to fix and correct so that they can succeed in their educational endeavors.